let me say a few words of introduction. This particular psalm is identified in the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah 31a, as the psalm for Friday. And so tomorrow, as part of morning prayers, Psalm 93 is recited. It's one of the psalms, frankly, that I know by heart because it's very short and I'm used to saying it, but I've never appreciated its richness till I prepared for this morning. By richness, is the challenge of unpacking a psalm a bit like a puzzle, or if you will, a Rubik cube on some level in terms of moving parts. Because in translating a psalm, psalms will often have rare words or words used in unfamiliar ways. Words with double entendres, as we saw yesterday and the day before, pronouns that can have double meanings as well. And because it's a short psalm, I have a little bit more time to show you some of the cadences embedded in the Hebrew that are artful and purposeful. And so this psalm is chosen for Friday according to the Talmud. The only one psalm, again, as we mentioned, that has in its inscription the day is Psalm 92, yesterday, where it's the Psalm of Shabbat. So this is identified only by the rabbis as the psalm for Friday, and they do so because there's a dimension of this short psalm, 5 verses, that presents God as the ruler over the mighty forces of creation. And on the 6th day of creation, in chapter 1, God surveys creation and says, Hine Tov, but adds for Friday, Hine Tov Ma'od, behold, it was very good, which is understood as the whole of creation is very good, complete. Now I am the ruler of what I have crafted. Now time for rest, time for Shabbat. And so Psalm 93 has this quality of creation, God's as the ruler. Like many psalms, particularly through the lens of our medieval rabbis, this psalm is messianic, meaning it's not describing this moment and God, it's describing a future time. That's for Rashi and Radak and Sforno, a future time when it will be a messianic era in which, in fact, the world's creation will be done. And an art scroll, as an example, verses 1 and 3 are in the past tense, as if it's from the messianic time looking backwards at an earlier time. And then verses 4 and 5 are in the present tense. So as a translator, I've had the challenge, again, this puzzle, because the 10 translations I look at are variable in terms of the tense, the meaning, and even more so in this case, because as I'll share with you, there is a lot of ambiguity with a clarity that God here is in control. And so the title for Psalm 93, the Psalm of Friday, I take from the opening 2 words, Adonai Malach, God reigns. Adonai reigns, majesty robed. Robed is Adonai with strength girded. Surely established is the world, not to be shaken. Firm is your throne from then, from everlasting are you. Flowing waters raised up. Adonai, flowing waters raised up their voice. They raise up flowing waters crashing roar. It is from voices of abundant waters, mighty breakers of the sea. Mighty on high is Adonai. Your testimonies are very trustworthy. For your house is suited for holiness, Adonai, for length of days. It's nice to have a shorter psalm today to get our heads around, but there's so much to say about this psalm. And so the opening image is God on the throne. Now again, at the time of the writing of Psalms, the world was a world of monarchies. And the monarch has absolute power by definition of the king of old. And here, this is a psalm of God as Melech HaMelachim. God is the King of Kings. And God is reigning and, like a king, is robed. By the way, it will be this opening image of verse 1 will be used as why we need to dress up to go to synagogue in the later rabbinic commentaries. As God puts on special clothes, so to be in God's presence, one should dress up. These are the clothes, often translated as clothed rather than robed, but I like the image. I chose robed because we think of the robe, of a king's robe, a garment in which one is enwrapped to signify authority. But in this case, there is an image, we'll find it particularly in later mystical writings, in which God's robe is creation itself. Meaning, unlike Spinoza, who is a pantheist, who said God is the sum total of creation, in the biblical mind, God transcends creation. Creation is God's handiwork, God's achievement, God's, if you will, signet, God's sign of God's achievement and power. And so here the opening metaphor, the opening image is that God is robed in majesty, geut. By the way, geut when used for a human is pride. But for God, as the commentators will say, God doesn't have pride, God has achievement. And therefore, geut for God is a positive. With strength girded. And there's a suggestion of God's power, but even usually Oz is related to military power. So God is not to be messed with. With strength, God is girded. Another aspect of God's majesty, or some translated as might. Surely established is the world not to be shaken, so that what God created is firm, is established, it is secure. God is the only God. And now, and verse 2, firm is your throne from then, from everlasting are you. This again is looking back. From everlasting are you. You are, if you will, infinite in terms of your origins. There is no such thing as when God began. God is everlasting, going back in time. And God's throne is firm, nachon, is correct, from then, me'az, often translated as from old, which is adding to the Oz, or trying to explain, if you will, the Oz. But the image is from the time of creation, from then, God was already existing. That's the creation story, that God brings, or at least brings order into creation. And here the theme is God has created an ordered world that is firm. Now, verses 3 and 4 deal with flowing waters. Nasu Naharot Adonai. I have chosen to translate Naharot as flowing waters. The verb comes first, but it's hard to do in English. In Hebrew, you can have the verb come first, the way it would in English be after the subject. Now, even the word Naharot, Look how varied are the translations of this key word in verse 3. I chose flowing waters, but that's because Naharot most commonly is the Hebrew word for rivers. Others understand it as currents. King James Version will translate Naharot as floods. Benjamin Siegel, who I was so reliant on yesterday, translates it as seas. Others translate it as torrents. And you'll see why. And you'll get the following 3 phrases in 3, which say the following, that the waters have great power. They roar. They can be frightening. But God, 3 and 4 go together, is even mightier than natural forces. Now here there's a background in ancient literature. The places that Jews knew had a belief in the powers of water as one of the great powers of the world in their creation story. So the civilizations along the Euphrates, the Babylonians, told the story of creation of Marduk, a god, who cut Tiamat. Tiamat was both Marduk's mother and also the goddess of the deep. And Marduk cut his mother into 2 parts in order to create his authority, with waters above and waters below. So his mother was split in 2, the heavens and the waters, with Marduk reigning supreme. That image of creation was an image of ascending to thrones through battle with water. The Canaanites, their goddess of the seas was called Yam. Yam, like Hebrew for ocean, because Israel is up against the ocean. And that mighty sea is also potentially threatening. And in the Canaanite mythology, Baal, who will become the supreme among other gods, will be in conflict with Yam. In the Bible, rejecting those creation stories, the Bible itself, chapters 1 and 2, God is the only creator. God is not, if you will, engaged in battle, but creating order. And that quality of creating order is what defines God here as well. And yet there is a vestige, an echo of this archetype, this historical context of the ancient world, seeing the waters as God's foe, as a mighty force. So listen to verse 3 and 4. Flowing waters raised up Adonai. Flowing waters raised up their voice. They raise up flowing waters, crashing roar. It is from voices of abundant waters, mighty breakers of the sea. Quote, mighty on high is Adonai. So there is this sense of a building quality. Some people say the way this verse 3 is in 3 parts is like waves, but listen to it even more. Listen to like verse 3 and 4 in Hebrew. Nasu naharot Adonai, nasu naharot kolam, yisu naharot dachyam. So there's this wave-like quality, but even more, listen to the sounds, the mems and rashas in verse 4. But look at like the 2 sounds of crashing or are in verse 3 are kolam, dachyam. You can hear the omnipoetic qualities. Listen to verse 4. Mikolot mayim rabim madirim mishperei yamadir b'marom Adonai. So the mems and the rashas and the e and the ah of 4 creates a rhythm, a sound of the flowing waters and the crashing of the seas. Again, that's where there is no translating the choices in Hebrew to create effects audibly. And psalms were again sung, they were heard. The rhythms and the sounds are part of the power of psalms in their original. And so here there's also an important choice in translation, in that I distinctly chose to put mighty on high as Adonai in quotation marks. And that's from a suggestion, though he didn't do so. I went one step further, and that's the great contemporary Talmud translator Adin Steinsaltz, who recently died about a year ago in Jerusalem, who translated the entire Talmud for the first time into Hebrew and into English and into Russian as well, with a core of translators under him. And he suggests that this mighty on high is Adonai is what is conveyed by the water. In that sense, it's almost like their song. And we have this image, and he emphasizes it, of, mountains dancing, the hills are dancing for God, celebrating. Here, it's the Disney water show, where the waters are, if you will, dancing, breaking, and in doing so, conveying God's majesty. Usually it gets translated like Samson Raphael Hirsch will take Adirim in verse 4 and translate it as mightier on high is Adonai. That's how it's usually translated. So it is from the voices of abundant waters, mighty breakers of the sea. Again, a description in verse 3 and the first half of 4 of the power of the water, and then saying, but even mightier than the waters is God on high. On high, the rabbis will explain in commentaries as removed from the day-to-day topsy-turvy world. So from on high, above it, can have the perspective to enable judgment. So verses 1 to 4 are a description of God and nature. They are part of the creation imagery, which explains why this is the psalm for Friday. And now verse 5 is a break from describing nature, at least mostly understood. Even here, there are some ambiguities. So now the final verse. Your testimonies are very trustworthy, for your house is suited for holiness, Adonai, for length of days. 5 is now going from God and nature, with, if you will, creation as God's garb, God's manifestation of presence, with God being other and hidden, but manifest. To 5, the last verse is about how God is manifest in human affairs, in the temple, in choosing to be a teacher. But here too, a pause. The opening word of 5, Eidotecha, your testimonies, can be understood in 3 ways. That's again the power of poetry, is multivalent possibilities. It can be either understood, your testimonies could be nature, the way nature just testified on your behalf in verse 4. So or it can just be the beauty of nature, is our prompt to appreciate God. Your testimonies could either be nature, it can be God's teachings, all of God's teachings, of Mount Sinai onward. God's moral laws are very trustworthy, a total shift to the human relationship. Or it could be specifically referring to the temple, for the tabernacle was called Mishkan HaEdut, the tabernacle of testimony, and the testimony refers to the 10 commandments. So your testimony, that one word, can be all of those or one of those. You can take your pick. Are trustworthy. This notion of ne'eman can be trustworthy or that they are faithful. You can see the word amen that we use in our prayers when we say amen. Yes, we believe it. God is worthy of saying amen to. This again, this quality of relationship that now segues to God's house, the temple, a physical structure. So other than the whole of creation, that is either na'ava can either mean pleasant or it can be ta'ava, which is sought after. That's how Radak understands na'ava. So it can either be for your house is suited for holiness or for your house is a pleasure pursued for holiness. And verse 5, again, the classic commentators will understand this as a messianic time. This, verse 5, is the third temple that's being referred to, the messianic rebuilding of the temple. And who are these flowing waters that are now looking back at? They are Israel's enemies. They were the torrential waters who are now flowing and paying homage to God. And that's Rashi, that's Radak. That is how they understand the trajectory of this psalm, that it's leading to the third temple, the completion, if you will, of creation. For length of days. We saw that phrase, for length of days, in the psalm that we did on Tuesday, Psalm 91, verse 16. It's the end of Psalm 23. It points to the future. This is a psalm that began looking backwards from everlasting are you to Adonai for length of days, looking forward. A way of saying that God spans all time. God transcends time. And what exists within time, nature, and a relationship with God, marked by the temple as being emblematic. And in the time of the third temple, because it's messianic, this will be understood as not just Israel, but the whole world will be, for Malbim, the whole world will be God's house in terms of all nations will honor God as creator. And so to pull this together, don't you love those sounds? I can't help but read it for you. Verse 4, the breaking of the breakers of the sea. You can see, the waves coming, that quality of rhythm of time, of the power of nature, unrelenting. Mikolot mayim rabim madirim mishpereyam madir b'marom Adonai. Ending with Adonai, with God. And so this remarkably moving psalm is one I didn't appreciate as so moving until I unpacked it. Today, just a little bit different, just 5 minutes, just a comment or two about how you've been moved by this psalm, or a question, and then we have a special treat, which is Hal, as one of our prayer leaders, is going to sing for us verses 4 and 5 with a melody by Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. And I'll say a word about the choice of verses for song. But just a comment or two, because we're short of 10 o'clock, not because we're short of 10 o'clock, but because it does enable an opportunity. Anything you resonated with in that description of Psalm 93? No hands are going up today. Okay, Irene from our friend from Manchester, England.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Irene.
Because you talked about royalty, and of course, we still have a monarch in the UK, but I think the relationship is based here more on a covenant. I mean, we've put up with her for a long time because she never really says anything out of place. She also hasn't ever visited the state of Israel, I should mention. But we're quite worried when Charles comes, what's going to happen, different kettle of fish. So I don't want to start getting political. And I know a lot of rabbis watch The Crown, which I've never watched. And it's probably an exaggeration, but not all royalty is like it was then. And maybe the relationship with God now is less of this royalty at a distance than close, anyway.
Thank you, Irene. I'm going to just build on Irene's comment and then Cantor Shula, and then I'll pull it together for today. So I'm so delighted always to have Irene with us, who, again, with the wonders of Zoom, is able to join us from Manchester, England, who's a scholar of Ibn Ezra and Jewish life. And Irene points out, as a resident of Great Britain, knows about royalty. And in this case, Psalm 93 conveys a different quality where, one, God is not just symbolically a royal or a former royal of absolute power, but God is seeking relationship. And in that sense, there's a sense of covenant. And that's embedded in this word eidotecha, that first word in verse 5, that God's testimony is meant for relationship, for teaching. And this quality of kingship is one, yes, of power, but striving at its core for, again, covenant. Thank you, Irene. Shula, Cantor Shula.
Just a little comment that came to mind about the word in verse 1, geut.
Yes.
I couldn't help but immediately remembering Shirat Hayam, when they stood at the Reed Sea, Ashir al Adonai ki ga'o ga'a. And so I looked at what Robert Alter had to say, and he said that geut, aside from meaning pride and everything else that you said that it means, it can particularly refer to the surging and the rising of water. And
Yeah.
I like that very much, because that shows that the poet set the tone for the poem he was about to give with the motif of water, and he gave it to us in the first line.
That's beautiful. And I also want to add in that regard, that Robert Alter, to expand on what Cantor Shula says, that the word geut in that regard is a pun about water rising. The rising of the tide is geut, because ga'eh is to, again, rise up. So for a human, it can be prideful. But for water, it's what water does. And as Cantor Shula says, ge'eh here points, Robert Alter emphasizes, to verse 3 to say this is a psalm about water. And last, to build on Cantor Shula's commentary, this is a psalm that also has the echo in the Song of the Sea. And there are many words here in this psalm that Benjamin Siegel points out are suggestions of Song of the Sea, because that is where God both manifested God's power of deliverance and did so with and through taming the waters. And that God's power over the waters is a motif, again, with a resonance in ancient creation stories of God as supreme over nature. In that sense, there's a lot literally stirring in this psalm. A very few words, lots of word plays. Note that the word for God is mentioned 5 times. For Yud He Vav He, the word Atah appearing once, and to you 3 times. There is at the same time a quality of intimacy. It's Irene's point. This psalm subtly has this tension between God's power and God's intimacy, unlike other royalty. With that, we're going to segue to Hal. Let me just say that it's a privilege for me to honor Hal. I love davening with Hal. Hal was a drum major in high school. And that comes to my mind, particularly with high holidays, where there's a lot of davening that Hal does, because Hal has a distinctive kind of rhythmic quality and a precision in his Hebrew pronunciation that for me creates a flow when I daven with Hal. And again, it's that rhythmic quality along with what's the right word? Unadorned quality. It's straightforward in terms of Hal singing. But with that, what Hal chose to share, in part because he saw Amy singing and Carl singing. So this week distinctly is Psalms with our prayer team, is a melody by Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. So just a word about Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. Many of us, I spoke to Irene the other day, she had encounters, I had many encounters with Reb Shlomo, many of us did, and that Reb Shlomo was the troubadour of Jewish music for the 60s and onward. He was born in Berlin in 1925, left Germany with his father, who was a famous rabbi. In Encyclopedia Judaica, there's the family tree presented of the Carlebach family. It was a famous German rabbinic family. And when he came to America, he went to the Lakewood Yeshiva of Rabbi Cutler, which was the Misnagdish Yeshiva. But he got involved in part through the Rebbe of Chabad into Hasidism and left that yeshiva world where he was considered a star student, and with guitar would become famous for his melodies, something like 2,000 different melodies that he would put on records and sing as he constantly traveled around the world. And one of those melodies is what Hal will now be sharing for verses 4 and 5. So before Hal sings it in Hebrew, let me just reread it in English, and then it's all you, Hal. It is from voices of abundant waters, mighty breakers of the sea. Mighty on high is Adonai. Your testimonies are very trustworthy, for your house is suited for holiness, Adonai, for length of days. Okay. And now.
Thank you, Rabbi. If I may, it's interesting that you brought up the rhythmic quality of my davening, and this hadn't occurred to me before, but I'll just bring up one thing in honor of my dad. When Dad passed away, we had his funeral in his hometown of Des Moines. But when we came back to Anaheim, Rabbi Tofield said, we'd really like to have a memorial service here. And Rabbi Tofield had picked up something about my father's davening. Dad was a fluent Hebrew reader, but not so much a fluent Hebrew speaker and singer. So he concentrated very hard on his davening. And Rabbi Tofield apparently picked up on that, because he said Shep had a style of davening as if each syllable mattered to him. And that's the first thought that occurred to me when you mentioned the rhythmic quality just now. So with that, to Shlomo Carlebach's melody. Mi kolot ma'im rabim adirim mishpereyam adirim b'marom Adonai Eidotecha nemnu meyod leveitcha nava kodesh Yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 yai dai 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 Adonai leorech yami.
Thank you, Hal. And as you can imagine, this is, it was the Hasidic tradition that the final meal of Shabbat, Su'udah Shlishit, there would be lots of singing, but even more so for Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach in the yeshiva world, there would be something called the Melava Malka, which was the singing to accompany the bride. That's what Melava Malka means, the accompaniment of the bride from Shabbat to the week. And at the Melava Malka, which was just after Havdalah, but not wanting, the Shabbat to fully leave, you could get out the guitar in a Hasidic world and play music to accompany the bride forward. And it was in that context that Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, as a yeshiva student, as a young man, began to write these melodies of pulling out verses of Psalms, which had precedent, and putting it to music, and then doing it over and over and over, creating a kind of an altered state, a hypnotic state that comes with repeating melodically words over and over. So Hal, thank you for allowing us to both honor you and to honor your dad today on his 44th yurt site. I invite those observing a yurt site in addition or in the period of mourning to rise to join together as, among others, we honor the memory of Shabtai Ruvain ben Yehuda v'Rachel as we join together for Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah
Amen.
v'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olmei maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei kusha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechamata da'miran yalma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Osei shalom v'romav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. So today is a holiday. I want to bring it to your attention. Today is Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of the month of Shvat, which is the new year for trees. It's a day to take a double take at the trees around us and all of nature, and to see again all of that beauty as God's garment, knowing that behind the beauty of creation is a resonating consciousness of love. So on Tu B'Shvat, added reason to appreciate with gratitude the beauty of our world, the gifts of trees. A special date coming up next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, will be at 9:30, but do put on your calendar that instead of 9:30 on February 17th, we will be having our class at 12:30, and we'll be doing so with an important contemporary composer, and that's David Lang, who's written a composition commissioned by the Lincoln Center on Psalm 101. That'll be in partnership with CSP. So I'm really excited about David Lang, who's my wife's cousin, and I'll add today on the Hebrew calendar is my wife and my anniversary. So I got not only a wonderful wife, but a wonderful extended family. You'll meet David on the 17th of February. To all of you, you're now prepared to recite Psalm 93 tomorrow as the Psalm of Friday and beyond it, to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.